Mute myself.
All right, we're rolling. Welcome, everybody. This is the cloud provider vSphere Syncup, the bi-weekly Syncup. Today is August the 29th, 2018. We don't have much on the agenda today, and the attendees list is pretty short, so we'll try to get a status update on what is going on with the cloud provider for vSphere, and then maybe open up for discussion for the CSI provider that we're trying to move out a tree in conjunction with the cloud provider.
Is there anyone here who can give that update though? Travis is out.
Yeah, Travis is out, so I don't think we can get an update on that. But Travis and I talked offline.
Okay, good.
There might be some, I wouldn't say progress, but at least some understanding of the path forward. Let me see if I can share my screen.
There's definitely an interesting development on the Google mailing list.
Yeah. All right. So current status for CCM. So right now, our plan was to have a functioning version of the Cloud Controlling Manager before 1.12 ships, and we're on track to deliver that. Unfortunately, we also wanted to provide storage functionalities as external CSI plugin for vSphere at the same time, and this is something that had an alpha version of the CSI plugin for the storage functionalities, but unfortunately, due to some misunderstanding, resource constraint, call it whatever you like, I don't think we're going to be able to do that, to pull that off. But still, from the CCM side, we're looking pretty good. Let me pull up the repo. So we're doing pretty good so far. David has done a lot of work in the creating a better reconciliation method for the out-of-tree CCM. So one of the reasons why we had, when we started working on this, the initial implementation of the CCM was relying on DNS names to reconcile the VM on vSphere and the Kubernetes nodes, and that was suboptimal, especially since the entry one was using UUIDs, which are like kind of more, I would say, a much better way to that kind of reconciliation between the platform and Kubernetes. David,
Can you speak to that a little bit, Fabio? I've been
Sure.
trying to get conformance tests running for the entry provider. This may be off topic, so tell me if it is. But a lot of the documentation is for the entry one is either incorrect or confusing, or they have a documentation for all versions of Kubernetes and the provider only page, so it's misleading. So it looks like they try to rename host names or VM names based on either Kubernetes node names or the VM names. I'm not sure, and it seems to vary based on version. And I guess ultimately the question is, why do they want to do any of that? Just for consistency visually, or?
Let me go back a little bit. Originally, and I'm talking about 2-3 versions ago, and I'm talking about the entry cloud provider now. The entry cloud provider 2-3 version of Kubernetes ago required to have the names of the VM spelled out in a configuration file. So you had to give those VMs a name on vSphere, and then put those names in the vcp.conf file that will end up in a Kubernetes node, right? And that was to perform that reconciliation. So basically, you were explicitly telling the cloud provider what were the VMs that were hosting Kubernetes on vSphere. That was obviously not ideal, which is why they changed and they made this reconciliation automatic. So you didn't have to specify to Kubernetes what were the VMs that were running Kubernetes on vSphere, okay? And that reconciliation is done through UUID. So UUID is, the UUID is basically the ID of the virtual hardware that VMware is presenting to the operating system. Okay, so the operating system can query that UID, and then through an out-of-band communication through the vModel API, can talk to vSphere and say, hey, I'm UID XYZ. You should go and check on vSphere which one is the VM that has UID XYZ. Okay, this is the reconciliation that is performed today in tree, and it's using UID. When we moved out of tree, the way that this reconciliation is performed in tree cannot be done out of tree. And this is because in tree, the code for the cloud provider runs on every single node because it's part of Kubernetes itself. So the code has two code paths, one for master node and one for worker nodes, which in reality are not supposed to be running that code at all because it's not meant to be run on worker nodes. And I'm talking about the CCM specifically, the cloud controller.
Now the worker nodes though still have the VCP conf according to Kubernetes instructions. They still are supposed to have the cloud provider configuration. So they still have access to the info, right?
Yeah, for in-tree, yes. This is exactly why we were having this problem. So originally,
okay, so for out of tree, it's adopting a more controller worker model where the worker is supposed to be dumber.
Exactly. So the problem was that the worker nodes with the in-tree cloud provider, the worker nodes are actually fetching a file on the host, which is under sys where the UID is stored. Instead of going through the Kubernetes helpers, because the Kubernetes has helpers that will give you.
Yeah, I got it now. This is the CSI model that I'm familiar with. But if you want to finish for the purpose of the video.
Yeah. So basically, what happened is that when we moved out of tree, the low-hanging fruit to perform this reconciliation was to just use DNS names because it was readily available. There was no need to dig into Kubernetes API at all. So we just used that. And we put forward an issue to make it better, going forward. And given that there was an outstanding issue to perform some refactoring of one part of CCM, Node Manager, David has picked up both issues and killed, two birds with one stone, basically. And, by refactoring the Node Manager Go file and also making sure that reconciliation is performed using UID. It's basically just a transformation that has to happen because apparently there's some, I don't know exactly why. It looks like an endianness problem, but the UID that is fetched through Kubernetes is part of it is reversed compared to the UID that VMware is exposing to the virtual hardware for whatever reason. I actually can point out that specific part of code change because it was. Interesting enough, there is a comment on that. And here, this is the PR that was merged a couple of days ago. There's a method that translates that here. So Kubernetes is putting out this type of UID. So the format is the same, but part of it, like the first half, is reversed. So this is kind of strange.
Wow.
Yeah.
This is really strange.
It is. It's kind of weird. So kudos to David because he figured it out. And apparently it works even, cross-platform, even though we didn't anticipate to have this run on ARM. But now that we have announced at VMware that we have ESX on ARM as well, we might as well, keep it engine safe for the sake of, potential other platforms. So there was definitely a highlight of the work we've done in the past couple of weeks. So the CCM itself is shaping up, real well, and I think right now the only part missing to, let's say, consistently deliver something for 112, and I'm talking just specifically about the CCM, not about the storage functionality, is the conformance test results that we need to provide.
I can speak to that if you'd like me to. So we just got the video of our weekly testing sync from what's today, Wednesday, from Monday, just posted this morning. From yesterday, just posted this morning. So I'll make that available to everyone. But essentially, Hui is putting the finishing touches on that container image for the outer tree tests. And what it's going to end up doing is we've got a multi-phased approach based on low-hanging fruit here and what we can do quickly being a relative term. But we will use Travis CI, and I'll work with you to set it up on the primary repo, which will essentially kick off the image into our cluster, our VMC control plane, so that a Kubernetes cluster gets stood up, turned up at a specific version, runs the cloud provider with the cloud provider, runs the conformance tests, and then uploads those to test grid. We spent the last week doing testing to ensure that we could do concurrent conformance test runs without affecting the control plane. And we have found that the conformance test suite as it is today does not mutate the control plane in a sufficient manner that we're worried about running multiple conformance test suites. So we'll likely want to go ahead and test against 111, 112 and head. I don't know if we want to. There were a lot of breaking. Well, I don't know if they're breaking. There were a lot of changes from 110 to 111 that makes any type of image we create or any type of automation we create that we would need to verify that this still works for 110. A lot of CLI options changed and whatnot, or deprecated, but it certainly works for 111 and 112 and head. And so hopefully over the next week, we're going to wire it up to my fork first and then push some commits there. We can actually see those results being created. We did hit a blocker, and Hui is going to follow up with the kernel team. I'm going to follow up with VMC, and I don't think any of you were on the call yesterday. But when we bring up VMs on VMC in the last week, we've seen either it takes 5 to 6 minutes to get an IP, which is weird. It's like we're running out of leases, which I did verify. But also, it's always taking 80 to 85% of memory for the first 10 minutes of a VM's life. Now, the guest OS shows using about 1 to 2%. But if you've got 32 gigs assigned to the VM, it's taking about 28 gigs of RAM, according to the vCenter UI. If you've got 64 gigs, it's taking up to 50. Now, the guest doesn't show that, but it's certainly seemingly making the VM slower. So we don't know what's going on there, and it's only started happening across multiple operating systems, CentOS and CoreOS, over the last 2 weeks. And I know VMC has been doing some rollouts, some cluster upgrades there. So I don't know if it's something in a new version of vSphere. DeWalt was trying to say that everything always takes it's a tools issue. Hui and I pushed back on that. I've worked with VMware for over 10 years, 15 years. I've never seen it spike like that unless the guest is also having some requests. There are no specific reservations. It's nothing that would indicate that it should always have allocated or present that it's been allocated that amount of RAM, reserve that amount of memory for the first 10, 15 minutes of a VM's lifetime. But it's slowing things down. It's making things take longer, and we're not really sure what's going on right now with that. So I think we would have had something by the end of the week, but we're trying to figure out what that's about.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that is.
So hopefully next week. Hopefully this is bi-weekly, right? And the next time we meet, I think we're going to have at least on the fork the ability to show that it's been automated. So
That sounds great.
Hey, DeWalt just showed up. Yeah. No, wait, is that the same? Yeah, same one. DeWalt, we were talking about the memory consumption. We were following up on that we discussed in a test call. But it was slowing down. It was seeming to impact and slow down the test runs. So we have not heard back on that yet.
Okay.
But we do know that VMC has been rolling out updates to their clusters. So it could be something there.
Yeah, I think
lastly, Fabio, what are your? I can put this in the issue. What are your recommendations for the tested versions of Kubernetes? 110, 111, 112 in head, or 111, 112 in head?
I will say 111 and patch releases. So
Sure.
111, 1 and 2 and whatever,
Yeah.
and 112 when it comes out, and head. That will be enough.
Okay. Sounds good. Well, I'll get that created in the fork too.
Yeah, for now, -1 sounds good. And if we start testing 111 now, and we're trying to declare alpha by the time 112 ships, 111 will be -1. And by the time, if we keep testing 111 as the baseline, as the oldest version, by the time we reach stable or beta, by end of year, we're gonna have -2 and -3 potentially. So we'll be good.
Yep, sounds good.
Okay. I just want to point out something for people that were not aware of that happening. We had a Doug McEachran last week doing a VCSIM kind of introduction / deep dive, and the recording is available on YouTube. So if you just look at the recordings for SIG VMware, there's going to be another video in between called VCSIM deep dive. Go check it out because it's pretty cool. And one last thing I want to call out on the CCM is the documentation. So we're not like super crazy on documentation yet. We do have some developer-oriented documentation in the repo right now. And I think it's going to be okay if we ship with just that type of documentation available for when 112 ships. But going forward, we should have better documentation for end users to set up CCM and CSI and other daemon set type of deployments on top of Kubernetes for these new auto tree plugins. So this is not yet something that is urgent to do. Also because the SIG cloud provider is trying to kind of organize this work in more consistent / coherent manner across all the cloud providers. So there's no like consensus yet on the type of documentation, the way it should look like, and so on. They're evaluating the change that SIGDocs has done to the content management system. I think they moved out of something else and they're now using Hugo. And there was some outstanding items there that had to be fixed before we can actually start cranking out new documentation. But again, something to keep an eye on, something that we'll love to get some help on, because documentation is always a massive problem, especially if people are making assumption on end users and maybe knowing about something that it's not like really spelled out in the documentation itself. So it's always nice to have not just one set of eyes on it, but more like an entire group looking after the documentation that end users should look at. And that said, I think we're all good for the cloud provider. I put here just a quick note on the agenda for the storage functionalities / CSI plugin. There is some confusion running around CSI right now. We're trying to figure out what is the best path forward. We're also doing some Syncup internally, as we have many people, not just from CNA View, working on this. And the general consensus right now for where the CSI plugin should land is in the repo with cloud provider vSphere. And I know this is not ideal. It is something that is kind of spelled out in the CAP that is, I would say, regulating cloud providers. I'm not a super fan of this decision, but it's there, and we didn't identify any other clear place where we can put that plugin. there is a Kubernetes CSI organization on GitHub that is owned by Kubernetes, but it's for Kubernetes specific components for CSI. So it holds like all the sidecars and everything. So it's not like something that should host vendor specific code, which is why Travis and I kind of decided, or wanted to keep this here for now, and so under Cloud Provider vSphere, so we can piggyback on the CI and on the all the process that we already have for Cloud Provider vSphere, without having to go through that process once again. And if other places will pop up as we go, we might even just get the CSI portion out of that repo and move it to somewhere else more apt. So for now, I think we're going to go with that. Once we cleared out all the I would say communication issues that we have with the Sabu folks. And that's pretty much it. Don't have any other updates on that. I will ask Travis to attend the next meeting to see if we can get like a more structured update on what is going on with CSI.
We're going to, and just a note, we may even want to schedule some type of internal Syncup to sort some of these issues of which you're aware out, because he may not be able to provide any update if we don't sync on that first.
Yeah, I think once this week passes and we have VMware behind and Golfer Gun behind us, it's going to be easier for us to just get on the same page on this, and then figure out what's the path forward. Just want to point out another thing which came up recently. There is a VMware/Kubernetes fork on GitHub that is currently used by VMware to host some of the issues that are specific to the storage implementation of the in-tree cloud provider.
That's not right.
And it's being discussed what we're going to do with that repo. I'm not a fan of having that repo. It has caused confusion with customers, partners, and just end users that are trying to get some information about running Kubernetes on vSphere. So we might want to, now that we have an official home under the Kubernetes org, I think it might be time to just clear that out, move all the outstanding issues that are still valid over to the new Kubernetes Cloud Provider vSphere repo, and close it down and just make it disappear.
Fabio, it should redirect. I have a question. This came up in SIG testing the other day, and you're a good person to ask. So there was a new, and I'll talk about it at the end of this week. I'm running the Syncup this Friday for Travis. Ben Elder from Google introduced a new tool called Kind for running conformance tests locally. It's actually very similar to what Hui's working on. So because it uses Docker and Docker, I had Hui check that out. But it's going to be housed or incubated, for lack of a better word, in the test info repo right now. But I said, should this live in its own repo? And he says, there's politics. But when he did mention that eventually it probably will, he mentioned the org Kubernetes SIGs. So I'm aware of the org. We've talked about it ad infinitum, but I'm still not clear. But and we're not even going to get to like why that name is not good. It's misleading. I guess misleading at best. What's the purpose of the org?
So I think I might have a decent answer to that, because I was puzzled myself by having.
They don't want code entry, and they don't want external code in org.
So, by the way, there's no like definitive answer on this.
Okay.
It's a work in progress, but I would say that the best explanation I got for this, and it's that what is sitting under Kubernetes org, so Kubernetes / something, is what is considered part of the Kubernetes blast distribution. It's like think of it as a reference distribution of Kubernetes.
No, I get it. It's two RPM repos. One is base and one is extra.
Yes, kind of like that. Yes, similar to that.
They could have come
I
up
would
with a
say
better name.
I would say that here it's more like um, this is what Kubernetes wants you to use as a reference for like the reference implementation of Kubernetes and the reference
Okay.
objects that end up in that reference distribution. And Kubernetes 6 is more like here's there's a lot of other projects going on around Kubernetes, but not necessarily part of Kubernetes, part of a Kubernetes distribution. More like
Yeah.
the batteries and the batteries included. Uh, you know,
I get it. I just,
project.
it's the name that's so horribly misleading, like Kubernetes Labs, Kubernetes Incubator, any of those,
Yeah.
I think would immediately tell you what it means. But the thing that screwed me up, probably not the only one, I thought there were some SIGs that didn't exist because I saw the repos and thought they were SIGs.
Yeah, that kind of confused me as well, first time. But I think it's it's more like an ongoing discussion. Last week during the SIG Cloud Provider call, Tim Hawking spent like I think 30 good minutes bringing back the idea of trying to figure out what is the right way to distribute Kubernetes, in a sense where should we make Kubernetes a kernel or should we make a Kubernetes distribution? Should we just make the kernel just the core, no vendor code at all, no nothing, just the kernel of Kubernetes become
Yeah.
the Kubernetes distribution, or should we make a Kubernetes distribution that has all the batteries included that you can use or replace?
So I've had this talk, you know, a long talk about this with Tim Pepper, who's not on the call today, unfortunately. And now what's happened in the last 2 weeks may have changed this, but my stance is I understand why Kubernetes wants to be like the kernel. Kubernetes can't, but the kernel doesn't depend on anything. Kubernetes can't be the kernel as long as it, in my mind, as long as it requires etcd to run. Now that etcd is part of the CNCF and it's open, I guess maybe you can, or open and more open, you can make the case, but to me, Kubernetes has a hard time positioning itself as the kernel when it has that requirement. But if you push that aside and just say, okay, that's the way it is, and it's going to be the way it is, then yeah, I absolutely believe that Kubernetes should operate like the kernel. I think it would make a lot of the discussions that people have. It would give a context to those discussions.
No, I agree. I mean, there's a lot of different aspects you can look at that. So it's not
Well,
like
people
an
have
easy. Yeah.
go ahead.
No, I mean it's not like an easy answer to this kind of question. It's
But
there's a
it
lot of
isn't. People have compared the work to the work on the Linux kernel, how that works. And I said, except the Linux kernel team isn't trying to distribute an application. They're distributing a kernel. And so the governance that works on that is different than the governance for Kubernetes, which is essentially trying to distribute Ubuntu
different.
and all the different pieces and SIGs that go into that. And so, yeah, I think there should be the Kubernetes kernel, and then the reference Kubernetes implementation, and then basically the only people that really talk to the kernel team, like SIG Arc, essentially, and they're focused on the kernel, and everything beyond that is on top of it. So anyway, that's just my 2 cents. But yeah,
All right. Uh, yeah, we made it to 6:33 here. So I think we can wrap up. That was a good meeting. Thank you guys. I'll see you at the next meeting.
all right, Fabio, when you hit
Thanks,
stop, I'm
Javi.
going to ask you a question.
Bye, guys.